Hello, everybody. So today I'm going to be talking about abortion. Not really about Roe v. Wade, but I've already spoken about Roe v. Wade in a conversation with my friend Luke. So if you're interested in that, I will link to it down there, and I suppose up there as well. So you can check that out if you're interested. But no, I'm just going to talk about abortion a little bit more generally without really making any reference specifically to Roe v. Wade or the implications of it being overturned potentially in the future. So the first thing I want to stress is that the moral argument for abortion being legal is really, really, really strong, incredibly strong. And of course, we all know what the argument is. It's the violin player thought experiment. For some reason, it's a violin player. I don't know why. It doesn't have to be, but the story goes that there's somebody who is a fully grown man or woman who is on death's door. They're about to die. And in order to be kept alive, they need somebody else to go through some kind of procedure, whether it's giving blood or giving, something, just whatever it is. It doesn't matter. It's a thought experiment. It's fantasy. And it just so happens that the experience of this, what is necessary to help this person survive is exactly equivalent to the average experience of pregnancy in terms of pain, discomfort, whatever else. Just if you took the whole just experience of pregnancy and imagine kind of equivalents in terms of discomfort and things like that, that's exactly what would be demanded of this person in order to keep this human being alive, this violin player alive. And the question is, can you legally compel this person, kicking and screaming, to do this thing, to provide their body to keep this person alive? Can you do it? And the answer to most people is intuitively no. You can't. You can't just grab somebody and just drag them to the, and they're like, I don't want to do it, I don't want to do it, no, I don't want to do it. And then you just drag them to the hospital and you just say, and here it is, you're going to experience the exact, equivalent to pregnancy, and you're going to be forced to do it to keep this other person alive. And we all know that's not okay. So the point is that the bodily autonomy argument is strong enough that actually the question of whether or not a baby in the womb, a fetus if you like, is a person is irrelevant, because we can all agree that this violin player is a person. They are a human being. And of course, I think we can all agree they have a right to life. I 100% agree, and I'm sure you do too, that this person has a right to life. If there's anybody who has a right to life, it's somebody who is a fully grown human being who, obviously they have a right to life. But the question is, does that right to life extend to compelling somebody else to keep them alive, even when that person doesn't want to? The answer, we all know, is no. So actually, the right to life is irrelevant. It doesn't trump women's bodily autonomy or anybody else's bodily autonomy. Now, it is worth pointing out some things which aren't really covered under bodily autonomy, just for funsies. So the first thing is that this is not the same as taxation. Something people will often do. So interestingly, actually, the first response video I ever did, actually it wasn't a response video, it was a response essay. But it was the first kind of response to a video, because I responded to a video via an essay, was to Stefan Molyneux, who was basically making an argument that amounted to arguing that any argument for bodily autonomy must also function as an argument against taxation. Because his thing was, if you can't just compel somebody to do something, how can you compel somebody to give up the product of what they've done, compel somebody to give up the product of their labor, taxation? And of course, that's just nonsense. The reality of bodily autonomy is that the morally intuitive sense that it's wrong to compel somebody to have something done to their body, to override somebody's bodily autonomy, is very much related to the directness of that action. As soon as it becomes removed even a little bit, the bodily autonomy thing becomes far less compelling. And it's certainly not like, for example, taxing cigarettes or subsidizing gym membership. I mean, in that case, you are both by taxing and also by subsidization, using some kind of influence to, affect what people are going to do with their bodies. However, you're not overriding somebody's free choice. We can use mechanisms of the state to discourage people from smoking cigarettes and to encourage people to go to the gym. That's fine. That's not overriding somebody's bodily autonomy. And indeed, we can use the mechanisms of the state to encourage or discourage people from doing all sorts of things. The one thing, like I say, that we can't do is just grab somebody and while they're kicking and screaming, force them to undergo a particular, whatever. But I will admit that sometimes it does get a little bit complicated. A good example would be vaccine mandates. So obviously, if you grab somebody and you hold them down and you force them to have a vaccine, which will cause them, potential side effects and things like that, that's violating their bodily autonomy. You can't, I think most people would say that dragging somebody kicking and screaming to get vaccinated, holding them down and vaccinating them, that's unconscionable. But then the question comes, what about saying, okay, you know what, if you don't want to have the vaccine, fine, you don't have to, but you'll be arrested, or you'll be taxed, or you won't be allowed to leave your house. At that point, you could say, well, even though it's indirect compulsion, it's sufficiently kind of compelling that it's kind of, it's bordering on direct. Like, if you're going to drag me off to prison, unless I agree to have something done to my body, well, you're punishing me quite severely. So, that's an example of where it does get a bit complicated. So, obviously the thing is, incentivizing somebody to use their body in a particular way, that is not a violation of bodily autonomy, even if, by the way, you disagree with it. For example, I think many people would have an objection to prostitution because you are using money to incentivize somebody to use their body in a particular way, especially if, for example, they are desperate because they're impoverished. You could say that's wrong, and I would agree with you, it's morally wrong. But I wouldn't say it's a violation of that person's bodily autonomy. So it's worth noting that, obviously, violating somebody's bodily autonomy does not encompass everything that's immoral. So it's worth just bearing in mind that, for me, bodily autonomy has to really quite reliably apply to things that are very direct forms of, like, demanding somebody use their body or have their body used a particular way. A good example of this is my take on giving blood, and I'm going to try and be very quick about this. Basically, I personally find giving blood really uncomfortable because of my anxiety. It would just be really horrible for me to do, and I have done it before, but and based on having done it before, I can tell you now that I am actually anxious, and I have anxiety as an issue I deal with, which I didn't used to. The idea of me giving blood is just unconscionable. There's just no way it's going to happen. But I do think that people should be incentivized to give blood. And therefore, I think it would make sense to have a system where there is, a slight increase in taxation, and then people are given money for giving blood. Because I think it's kind of unreasonable to expect people to do something as uncomfortable as giving blood and just get nothing in return. So the thing is, in that case, so I should say that it was actually a libertarian who first made me kind of realize a key point about bodily autonomy, because this libertarian was talking about, like, the idea of mandating giving blood, and they said, well, anybody would think it's acceptable for somebody to be dragged off kicking and screaming to go and give blood. That's just ridiculous. That's a horrible, evil thing to imagine happening. Somebody just desperately trying not to have this thing happen to them, and then they're strapped down and they're just forced to endure this thing. That would be horrible. And I agree. The interesting thing is this libertarian would probably also disagree with what I just said there about, having an increase in tax and then the government paying people to give blood. But for me, that doesn't violate bodily autonomy, because at that point, you lose a little bit of money, but if you value, the act of not doing that thing, giving blood, more than you value the money, then you have a choice to make. So that's an example of how I think that, for me, there is, I do agree, like, the idea of just physically forcing somebody to give blood is unconscionable. But taxing somebody a bit and then saying, hey, if you, want that money back, you need to give blood, as far as I'm concerned, that's fine. And if indeed, incentivizing giving blood would, in, kind of the grander scheme of things, help to save lives, I would say it's maybe worth doing. But yeah, I don't think it's going against somebody's bodily autonomy. So once we realize what we're talking about here, we're talking about people being forced to have something uncomfortable, something unpleasant, something very, and again, if I relate this to my anxiety, something I'm very much aware of is that I feel like I would just have panic attacks quite often if I were pregnant, just because like the whole thought of it is a bit to me, like the idea of having a human being inside of you and like feeling it kick. Like to me, that would just, I don't know about that. Like feeling something kick you from the inside, I feel like I would be freaking out like on a quite regular basis. And, just based on the mental aspect, never mind getting into the physical, that's why I think, getting pregnant, it's, it seems like quite unpleasant. And obviously, in a very real sense, I think for a lot of people, it's worth it. They would like to just be able to, it's worth it to have a kid at the end of it. And that's great. But the thing is, I don't think you should ever be, I don't think people should be forced to be pregnant. I don't think somebody who doesn't want to be pregnant should be forced to be pregnant. And, like for me, when I imagine banning abortion, I think about 15-year-old girls who are absolutely terrified of what's going to happen to their body and the idea that they can't do anything about it to stop it. And as far as I'm concerned, that idea of a, and it doesn't have to be, but I say I bring age in it just to kind of show the full extent of the vulnerability we could be talking about. This isn't to say that a 20-year-old girl has less of a right, but we're talking about somebody very vulnerable. If we're talking about somebody who's quite young, who has this thing about to happen, and as far as I'm concerned, that is just enough right there to be like, well, she needs to have a choice. If this thing's going to happen to somebody, they need to have a choice about that. So the reason I think this is an incredibly strong argument is because it means that the personhood of the baby is irrelevant. It doesn't matter if we're talking, because even if we're talking about a full-grown human, even if we're talking about me, a member of my family, even if I had a child and that child, needed to be kept alive by somebody being compelled to do this thing, or by somebody agreeing to do this thing, I would still say, you know what, no, we cannot compel somebody to do this thing. We can't compel somebody to have this thing happen to their body against their will. So it's really strong. And that is, nothing to be sniffed at, nothing to ignore. It's an incredibly strong argument. But perhaps it's almost too good because it leaves the morality of abortion entirely unaddressed. And I think lots of people will almost like act as if they don't care. They'll be like, well, as long as the legality of abortion is fine, that's all that matters. That's it. Like people seem to think that the only thing that matters, and obviously that's kind of become the thing of like the pro-choice versus, the very fat people call themselves pro-choice. It's almost like, well, whether abortion is a good thing is irrelevant. People need to have the choice. And don't get me wrong, that is important. I do agree. The choice really does matter. And maintaining the legality of that choice is really important. The fact that we have such a strong argument for, autonomy and bodily autonomy being a valuable thing is great. But it's kind of like, it seems a bit weird to act as if it doesn't matter whether or not abortion is immoral. Because the reality is that many, many people are still going to, at some point, be faced with that choice. And it seems a bit weird to have a choice which, by law, we're saying people are allowed to make, and yet we're going to act as if the actual question of what choice morally should they make is irrelevant. Is abortion a morally wicked, evil, unconscionable decision that you should nonetheless be allowed to make? Or is abortion just morally neutral or even a positive, potentially in some situations, a positive thing to do? Because that's the issue with the bodily autonomy argument. Like I say, if I had a child, and I think I'll talk about me having a child because I think it's just an even kind of stronger way of making the point. If I had a child and that child had some kind of rare disease, again, this is all talking about hypothetical, a rare disease, and the only way was that this one specific person had to agree to go through this physically uncomfortable process. Not, Obviously, pregnancy is uncomfortable, but it's worth noting it's not like, it's not horrendously uncomfortable, I would imagine. There's the old joke about like how, what's worse, pregnancy or getting kicked in the balls. Plenty of women get pregnant and then later on decide to have another kid. No man ever gets kicked in the balls and then says later on, oh, you know what, I fancy another kick in the balls. So, obviously that's a joke, but, it kind of does get to the point. The fact that women agree to have children, even after they've gone through it once, they agree to have children many more times potentially, shows that while pregnancy is nothing to be ignored in terms of how uncomfortable it can be, it's something that people are very much capable of doing. So in this situation, imagine somebody has to go through an experience equivalent to a pregnancy in order to keep my child alive. And this, we could say this is a 10-year-old child, a child with a personality, a childhood with dreams, and a childhood a child you could have a conversation with. And there was somebody who needed to do this thing. I would, again, to stress the bodily autonomy argument again, I think that this person, whoever they are, who has this choice to make, should be allowed to make that choice. I would not, even if it were my child, I would not support that person being dragged and forced to go through this thing. But there is a choice that I will plead with you and beg you to make. And if you do not make that choice, spoiler alert, the choice I would plead with you to make is the choice that would sacrifice some of your discomfort, but would keep another human being alive. If you didn't make that choice, I would not hold you in particularly high regard at all. I would think that you were being incredibly immoral and selfish. And the thing is, so I've already said that I'm against giving blood, or not against it, but rather the idea of giving blood is incredibly uncomfortable to me. But if I'm saying that in a context where it's well, I'm just one person, it's not gonna, the reason why is because it's not gonna make a difference. But if I knew that I had to go through something, even something uncomfortable, even as somebody with anxiety, but I knew that was keeping somebody alive, I would obviously make that choice to keep that person alive, and I would not be able to live with myself if I didn't do that. I would not be able to live with myself if I did not make an effort to keep that person alive. And I would hope, like I say, that if it were my child who needed somebody else to, actually just go through, whatever amount of discomfort to keep my child alive, and they refuse to do it, that they would not be able to live with themselves either, that they would be haunted by the idea that they made a deeply immoral decision. So that's the point. You should legally be allowed to do that. Nobody can legally compel you to go through that discomfort to keep somebody alive. But right then, I'm saying that if you didn't keep a child alive by going through that discomfort, if you didn't make that choice, it would be a horribly wicked, evil thing to do, and you should not be able to live with yourself. You should be haunted by that decision for the rest of your life. That decision to put your own personal comfort above the life of a child. So you can kind of see what I mean when I say that, considering that a lot of people would say actually that if you have an abortion, you shouldn't be haunted for the rest of your life by that decision. You can see how actually the idea that you should be able to make that choice, well, that really it's not sufficient when there's a huge, massive, great big question of if in some contexts you clearly should make the decision that will lead to a human being being kept alive. Clearly you should, and you should feel awful and horrible and just, like I say, be haunted for the rest of life if you don't make that decision. What about abortion? That's what I want to talk about. I want to talk about what about the morality of whether or not, of keeping the fetus, the child, the baby, whatever else alive. So, first thing I want to talk about is, okay, you know what, let's just get it out of the way. My main argument in this video is going to be that I think it's kind of complicated. I'm going to err on the side, or kind of, maybe not err, but basically I'm going to kind of lean towards the side of it's probably fine, but the main conclusion of this video is going to be it's complicated, And I kind of find it interesting that it's complicated. And I feel like the obvious argument for the legality of making it so people can choose, bodily autonomy, choose to have an abortion, is far less interesting and kind of almost in a way does not do credit to the much more interesting question I think of, is it the right decision to make? And I think it's worth, like I say, talking about is it the right decision to make when loads of people are going to have to make this decision. So shouldn't we talk about that? Like, shouldn't we just talk about whether or not something's immoral or moral? Doesn't that make sense? Anyway, now, I'm mostly going to be focusing on kind of arguments for why abortion isn't so bad. Why that choice isn't so bad. Because to be honest, I've already sort of hinted at the anti-abortion side, by referring to the idea of like, if I had a child, then of course you should try and keep the child alive. But why isn't abortion so bad? Well, the first thing I want to point out is kind of the feeling of the abortion debate. Because, if you remember my video last week on homosexuality, one of the things that I spoke about is how it doesn't even seem like it seems like the sides don't actually reflect what's being claimed. Like, it doesn't actually seem even like the people who claim to be against homosexuality are even against homosexuality. And it's kind of a similar thing here. I'm interested in, does this even seem, when you look at the debate, like it's a debate over killing, over death, over murder? Not really, is going to be my contention. So the first thing I want to point out is like the analogies that pro-life people make when talking about the abortion debate. So the most obvious analogy they make is to a genocide. And, so they'll obviously talk about Germany in the 1940s. And, they'll say like, oh yeah, this is a genocide. But that's really kind of dumb because pro-choice people, or indeed even people who have abortions, don't hate babies. They don't dislike babies. Like, the issue is that if you're going to argue that abortion and the kind of frequency of abortion is comparable to a genocide, you have to deal with the fact that if that's true, it's nothing like any other genocide that's ever happened in terms of the motivation and feeling about it. Like, the main motivation for people having abortions is clearly that the people having abortions just don't actually think that the lump of cells inside them is a person at this point. Like, that's pretty obviously it. And then you compare that to actual genocides. Genocides are preceded by people, ramping up anger and like saying these people are horrible, trying to show that an entire group of people needs to be exterminated. And it takes a huge amount of hatred and distrust to justify genocide. And of course, that is the prevailing emotion that underpins genocides. Hatred, things like that. Maybe fear in some contexts. And certainly no enthusiasm at all to the people being genocided. The issue is, if we're talking about babies being genocided in the womb via abortion, then you have to recognize that there's no hatred, there's no fear. Like, nobody's angry about babies. Nobody, I have no strong feelings at all towards fetuses, one way or another, and I think most people don't. And if people do have strong opinions, I would think the overwhelming opinion people have would be one of cuteness, like a sense of adoration and like, oh, isn't that adorable? And certainly if they actually want the pregnancy and therefore, want the fetus to develop into a baby, or however you want to refer to it, a post-birth baby, an actual child and all of that, then a even more like a sense of cuteness, like, oh, isn't it, like people who are, out, you ever just go shopping and you see like the tiny little baby socks, and even me as a dude, when I see those baby socks, I'm like, adorable. They're just so cute. I melt when I see those tiny little baby socks, because I imagine the tiny little baby feet and the tiny baby nose and the tiny baby ears, and it just, giving the baby, and like, I say all of that. And obviously all of this indicates, a strong amount of enthusiasm for the old babies. But the idea, like I say, of somebody having an abortion, actually, it doesn't really bother me that much. And, obviously it's not really, well, I would be welcome to be kind of included in a decision that would be made about this, if whether it's just giving advice or whatever else. Obviously, it's not ultimately going to be my choice at any point whether or not to abort a baby. But yeah, I would happily, if I were included in that, say, hey, maybe there is an argument for abortion being the best option. But you'll notice, yeah, this is not hatred. This is not like the attitude of somebody who is engaged in a genocide. And to me, that just seems like an interesting thing. Like, if you're going to argue this is murder happening on a massive scale, you have to recognize that the attitude of society towards this is not the way that you would usually expect society to. Because I'm not saying society can't commit mass murder. Societies have committed many mass murders throughout history, but not usually, like, nothing like this. So in a way, by trying to make an analogy to mass murder and genocide, pro-lifers seem to just be undermining their point. Because, yeah, babies are adorable. It very much reminds me of the gender-critical debate, and that one of the reasons why I struggle to take trans identity seriously, one reason among many, is because of the fact that my motivations are so frequently mischaracterized. So obviously people say, I hate trans-identified people or whatever else, they come up with all these weird things, and it's just, I don't think the arguments being given make sense. And I would say that, yes, mischaracterizing somebody's reasons for an action or belief or whatever else is often going to have the effect, I think quite rightly, of counting as evidence against your position. Counting as evidence against your position as somebody who's opposing you. So when all the TRAs are saying I must hate trans-identified individuals and I must just be a bigot who's like, all of this stuff, and they, really stress this point, I must be an angry bigot who's just like furiously angry, then my assumption has to be that, well, first of all, I observe they're wrong, and then I conclude, well, if the main argument they're giving against me is something that's not correct, that would kind of imply that their whole argument isn't correct. Like, if you can't actually recognize why it is the people you're disagreeing with are doing the thing they're disagreeing with, then that kind of suggests you don't really understand it, and therefore your arguments against it, can perhaps be more readily dismissed. So I think the same thing applies here. If you can't really give an accurate account of why somebody might choose to have an abortion, and you're like characterizing it as like a genocide or something like that, then that would seem to be sufficiently far removed from the actual reason that people don't really have to take your objections seriously. And it's also quite difficult to argue that abortion is immoral if it's not underpinned by some kind of vice. Obviously, genocides are underpinned by hatred, by like things which you could imagine being the types of emotions and feelings that would underpin an evil action. The closest I think you can get to that with abortion is the idea of like kind of selfishness and a kind of a decadence and a callous disregard for the life of others, a kind of, like callous sense of, well, I don't want to have a baby, I don't care, whatever, just, like basically, yeah, a kind of selfishness, a sense of like, I just want to do what's good for me and not commit myself to raising another human being. And sure, I can accept that seems slightly more likely to actually describe the motivations of some people who choose to have an abortion. But that's not anything close to genocide. It's just selfishness, it's decadence, it's whatever else. It's, people only looking out for themselves, which is certainly not a good thing, but it's not indicative of genocidal intent. Now, the other issue I have is not just the characterization of the pro-choice position that's offered by pro-lifers, but also the behavior of pro-lifers themselves. Because the thing is, pro-lifers, according to them, they're out there stopping a genocide. And I think it's like 57 million, and it's probably more now, because this is an old thing I've heard, 57 million babies have been killed via abortion in the United States since, like Roe v. Wade was legalized. And of course, the funny thing is that I would imagine huge numbers more were killed before then, because that's kind of another thing which I can't even be able to get into, the fact that Roe v. Wade didn't really even increase the amount of abortion. But the thing is, yeah, like, if 57 million people have died, that's like the worst thing ever. And I just don't see pro-lifers acting as if they're really like, kind of one of the things I've said to kind of people who have been pro-life is, if you really think that 57 million people are dying and, or have died, and this is like an ongoing genocide that's just killing so many people, then I tell you what, I hope that I never have you in my corner when I'm being genocided, because you seem to have no regard for this at all. Like, that's kind of the issue. One of the things that prevents me from viewing abortion as murder is that it seems to me like all the people who do view abortion as murder don't really care that much, which is kind of scary. Like, oh, so you think like a huge number of babies are being murdered, and your solution is just to stand there with a bunch of like signs protesting it? Like, this is the thing, okay? I find it funny when people attack pro-life people for like blowing up hospitals and targeted killing of doctors, as if that makes them hypocrites. But for me, that's the only thing they could do that would make sense. Like, if you actually believe a genocide is being committed, you should be fighting a war over this. Like, even I obviously I made my video on Ukraine. I'm against the old humanitarian intervention most of the time, mostly because I would tend to put quote marks around it. I don't really think it is humanitarian intervention. But, I would admit that when you start talking about millions of people being killed, that's enough reason to go and invade another country. It's certainly enough reason to start a civil war. Like, that's my issue. I find it crazy that people are like, oh, pro-lifers, oh, they're killing doctors, that's awful. It's like, no, when they're killing doctors, that's the only time they're making sense, if you ask me. Because it's like, if they genuinely believe that, like, my analogy would be, if I found myself suddenly transported to Germany in the 1940s, and I saw somebody who oversaw one of the death camps, I'd kill them. And, like, I don't even think, like, who wouldn't? Only like a kind of crazy off-the-wall pacifist would be like, oh, I don't want to kill, a concentration camp guard. Or, somebody who runs a concentration camp. Really? You don't? Okay, fine. Massive pacifist. But most people would. Often not even to, like, even if I didn't know that it was going to achieve any kind of actual effect, I'd be like, well, this person is still morally culpable for huge numbers of deaths. Of course I should kill them. And I wouldn't care if that was an extrajudicial killing either. I would just kill them. If I had a gun and I was like, and so and then, hello there, I have escaped. I mean, I am outside of the concentration camp which I run. It's nice to meet you today. I have killed many of the Jews. I have killed them all because I am running the concentration camp. I'd be like, okay, like, and who wouldn't? Like, what? Are you so pacifist that you're not going to kill like an actual person who runs a concentration camp and is like responsible for death? No, of course, because you believe that this person is part of a genocide, has killed probably hundreds, if not thousands of people personally, and is part of a wider system of basically genocide on an industrial scale that is killing millions. Killing this person makes sense. So my question is, why aren't, like, I'm not sat there being like, well, why are pro-lifers killing doctors? Why are pro-lifers why are pro-lifers bombing abortion clinics? That doesn't seem very pro-life. It's like, no, that seems like the most logically consistent thing they could be doing. If they actually believe people are dying, they should be, engaged in armed insurrection. They should be out there in the Rockies doing hit and run attacks on government vehicles to try and tear down the system so they can, like, they should be doing something mental. They shouldn't just be, and this is the issue. They don't seem like they're actually fighting against a mass genocide. They seem like they're mildly annoyed that or maybe even very annoyed. Maybe I'll give them that credit. They seem like they're very annoyed that they can't tell women what to do. And that's kind of the issue. It seems like the annoyance of people losing a culture war more than it seems like the righteous fury of people fighting against a system which is killing millions of people. And this would also cohere with the fact that abortion became way more of an issue after, like, Roe v. Wade, and it kind of became like a culture war issue. Like that's kind of that's when I look at this, I'm just like, not only am I skeptical of the claim that a fetus is actually a person who has a right to life that's worth defending, but I'm skeptical of the claim that even pro-lifers believe that, because they do not seem to be acting in a way. And if they are acting in that way, then I would argue they are scarily immoral, or like have no, like, it's just insane for me to imagine that they actually think that this huge genocide is happening, and they're like, right, like, I mean, best case scenario, they're like, all right, time to get the placards, but a lot of them presumably aren't even doing anything, and it's like, I don't know, I would hope that if I ever believed that in the UK millions of people were being systematically genocided, I would do a little bit more. One of the reasons I think this question of like, how do people react to abortion matters is because of virtue ethics. Now, virtue ethics basically is a theory of ethics that argues that things are either right or wrong, basically just because of how they feel. Like, there's just a general sense of things being right or wrong. Or alternatively, another way of talking about it would be to say things are more right or wrong based on what they tell us about the person who would perform that action. So we have a sense of like and that's why it's called virtue ethics, because we would want to see somebody who is virtuous. So we actually start with this idea of the virtuous person. So it's essentially, unlike some other ethical theories, it doesn't start with the action and then say, well, a virtuous person is somebody who does these actions. Rather, it starts with an idea of a virtuous person. You imagine a virtuous person, and then you say, well, what kind of thing would that virtuous person do? Anyway, it's actually it's the best ethical theory, and the obvious evidence for it is the trolley experiment. So the proof of the trolley experiment, very simply, is, of course, as you know, there's a train, or a trolley indeed, and it's heading towards 5 people, but if you flip a switch, it can just kill 1 person instead. Do you flip the switch? The majority of people say yes. They say, well, of course, yeah. If it's a choice between killing 5 people or 1 people, I'm obviously going to choose just killing the 1 person. And then the next example goes, okay, now in another situation, you have 5 people who are about to die from some kind of illness, and you can kill 1 healthy person and distribute their organs to the 5 sick people in order to keep them alive. Do you kill the 1 healthy person in order to use their organs to keep the 5 unhealthy people alive? And most people will say no. Most people at that point would say no. And, there are other examples of it, like, do you push somebody in front of the train to slow it down or something like that? Or do you shoot the conductor or something else? But the interesting thing about it is that in all these situations, you're talking about killing 1 person to save 5 people. And yet, most people don't, or most people have very different opinions about whether or not these actions are moral or immoral. And what this completely destroys is consequentialism. Consequentialism is the ethical theory that things are right or wrong based on their consequences. The thing is, that's not true, because in this case, the consequences are identical. You have 5 alive people, 1 dead person. The only difference is the action involved. And what we would basically say as, virtue ethicists is that the action of flipping a switch is not particularly lacking in virtue. There's nothing unvirtuous about flipping a switch, whereas the action of killing somebody, like actually physically killing somebody and then cutting them open, and just, these are all, like, that sounds worse. It just has a worse feel. And that's kind of why I think, and like, you can say, oh, well, that sounds like kind of a dumb way of defining ethics, just the feel of something. But actually, it's far more consistent with most people's intuitive sense of morality. Most people don't believe something is right or wrong based on its consequences. They just have a general sense of things feeling bad or good. And that's why I think it matters whether or, when we talk about the pro-abortion position or the pro-life versus pro-choice, which side feels, or how does each side feel? Does abortion feel like a genocide? And the answer for most people would seem to be no, it doesn't. Now, I do want to talk about the value of life very briefly, because that's another question. We talk about personhood. We're talking basically, people use this term personhood. What we're really talking about is the value of somebody's life. Now, as I've pointed out already, the value of somebody's life does not override somebody else's bodily autonomy, but it certainly relates to morality. If somebody's life has no value at all, you shouldn't sacrifice anything to save that person's life necessarily. But if somebody has life is very valuable, intrinsically valuable, if you will, then of course you should be willing to. You should feel some positive moral obligation to help that person and keep that person alive. So the question becomes: at what point does the value of a life become such that you have a positive moral obligation to keep that life alive? Not a legal obligation, but a moral obligation. Now, interestingly, I'm very much here reworking a video I made for my main channel years ago, which I've since unlisted. But basically, my argument would be that the value of life is something that pretty much increases until it reaches a certain point where it drops off. And what I'm basically talking about here is I would argue the value of life is found in things like your personality, your wants, your desires, your aspirations, things that make you who you are, make you an individual, things that basically make you more of a person, really, let's be honest here. And like things that would make people, if you were to die, for example, say, oh, I miss that person. And obviously, that's something which to be honest, I think kind of, it peaks when you're in your prime. When you're in your prime, you are developed, you have a brain, well, everyone has a brain, but you have a mind, you have like a sense of who you are as a person. And at that point, like people, it's a point where you can form the most deep, meaningful relationships with people. And these are all things, when you talk about what makes us essentially human, these are all things that add to your value as a human, add to the value of your life. And then I would say when you talk about kind of the value of your life dropping off after a point, it's when you've kind of done more with your life. I would argue, somebody's life is kind of at its peak value when there is so much they could be, but there isn't much they actually have been yet. So we're talking somebody in kind of their early 20s, maybe going into their 30s, like somebody who's never had a family, never really excelled in their job. And then, of course, eventually you get to a point where somebody's actually done, the best years are behind them, they've done everything, and all they've got left is, kind of the slow decline until death. So if you imagine it's kind of like you start off and you're building yourself up, you're becoming more and more, like you're getting all of these ideas, things you want to be, stuff like that. And then eventually, you reach your 20s or whatever, and you start actually living your life, and you're kind of, you've got all these things that you can be, but also all of these things that you have done. And then eventually the things you can be start to drop off because you're getting old, you can't have kids anymore, your kids are leaving, you're getting to a point where whatever, and, boom. You reach a point where obviously, and that's the thing, like I've had elderly relatives die and I just don't care at all. It doesn't bother me because they're old. Like they've reached a point where, there's nothing left. And similarly, I've had people in my family have miscarriages. So I've kind of had both ends of the spectrum. I've had people die in my family. I'm talking like I've had people in my family live into their 100s. And do you know how much sadness I felt when those people died at the age of 100? No sadness. Of course I didn't feel any sadness. Because they'd lived their whole life. What was that like? What am I thinking? Oh, there was so much left they could have done. No, that's nonsense. But similarly, same thing for the kids who died in a miscarriage, right? I wasn't sat there thinking to myself, oh, I really liked that person. No, because they weren't anything. And that's kind of like my attitude to, like, I would not grieve for a baby the same way I would grieve for an adult person. Because the adult person actually has a personality. They have wants and ambitions. A baby has none of those things. It's not as if I could sit there and be like, oh, that baby, they were really nice. Oh, I had a good relationship with them or whatever else. No, I don't really have any sense of that baby being a person. And I don't think anyone else does either. Like, are you going to actually say that there is not a fundamental difference between the way you would grieve a baby and the way you would grieve an adult person? Like an adult human, whatever they are? Because there should be a massive difference. Because an adult person had all of these wants, ambitions, like actual things that make up who they are. And a baby doesn't have any of that. And like personally, if a baby died, my sadness would be almost entirely dependent on the feelings of the parent. Like that's kind of a big thing. when an adult person dies, like an adult man, whatever else, dies, I feel more sad for them that they are dead than I do for anybody else. Because they could have lived a life. They could have done all this stuff. They had ambitions. They had wants, and now they're not able to do those things. Of course, I feel sad for their parents. I feel sad for anybody in their life. But I feel very much sad for them as well. Sad for them that they are dead. In the case of a baby, I don't feel any sadness at all for the baby in and of itself. Like, it's not like I'm just like, oh, that baby really, I mean, they really had all these things they wanted to do in life. No, but I of course feel sadness for the parents, because I imagine they would feel tremendously upset about that. Now, here's the thing. You might be wondering, am I saying that it is okay to kill a newborn baby? Because, you might say, well, hold on a minute, your whole argument seems to actually suggest that personhood doesn't even begin at birth. And I would agree. I think personhood is something which gradually develops. Like that's my take. And based upon that, it's what we need to do is pick an arbitrary point at which point we say, okay, you can't kill this person anymore. Because obviously I don't think there's like a single point where a human being goes from being just like a genetically human being, but just like an organism, to being like a person with a right to life and all of that stuff. However, this is not a particularly rare thing. There are many examples of things in life where somebody doesn't just immediately go from one thing to the other. People, and then what we have to do is pick an arbitrary point. A really good example is the age of consent. There is no point at which it's not as if like there's just, this person was totally, completely immature and totally unable to consent, and then in an instant they're suddenly perfectly able to consent. No, that is nonsense, and nobody actually believes that. Rather, we all recognize that people slowly build up emotional maturity and are slowly, increasingly able to consent, and therefore we pick a random arbitrary point which we think is roughly in the right area, and we're like, okay, we'll roughly go for this, and we'll just say, okay, this is the point. This is the cutoff line. And that is the best system we can do. And indeed, it's the case of all sorts of other things. There are many instances, like a huge amount of morality, a huge amount of like whether an action is right or wrong is a spectrum. Morality is filled with spectra. But the law needs binaries, or at least some kind of discrete categories. It needs to be able to say, this is right, this is wrong, this is legal, this is immoral. This is legal, this is illegal. That's what the law has to be able to do. So we need to pick these random points. So why not just pick a random point? Like, that's the thing. I actually saw a whole video once arguing against abortion, and literally the whole point of the video made no other point than that basically any argument for abortion involves picking random points to say it's either acceptable or non-acceptable. And it's like, yeah, that's how the law works, you dingus. So yeah, that's kind of my take. I do think personhood is something that develops, and I would feel far more sad about, like a slightly more mentally and emotionally and just generally kind of like a fuller, more developed person dying than I would about somebody who is just a baby, has no, they're not, they've got nothing to them. They've got nothing to them, and that's simply it. Yeah, as far as I'm concerned, I just think they're two very different things. But obviously, you can't have judges just kind of being like, well, this person was kind of becoming, this human being you murdered was kind of becoming a person. So, like, that doesn't make any sense. So we just pick a random arbitrary point. What I am confident of is that it's ridiculous to say that a lump of cells, like at the moment of conception, immediately becomes a person. Like, I just don't think the term person means very much if it's just like, as soon as like sperm meets egg, you just immediately have a person. I think that's kind of silly. But I also, of course, think it's silly to suggest that a fully grown adult isn't a person. So there has to be a point somewhere where we say you go from being a person, or rather go from not being a person to being a person. So we pick a random arbitrary point. When there's a heartbeat, when there's, whatever it is, it doesn't really matter. Now, the other point I would stress is virtue ethics. because I've already made that point, we talk about the feeling of an action. And I would argue it is far worse in terms of the feeling of an action to kill a baby, like an actual baby outside the womb, than it is to just go to the doctor, take a pill, get some kind of, procedure. My question would be, and I think this is a very strong argument, we have to talk about the kind of person that would do an action. Like the kind of person who would take a pill that kills a baby in the womb is a fine person as far as I'm concerned. The kind of person who would actually take a real baby and like kill it, like actually outside the womb, like, strangle it or stab it or shoot it or whatever else, that's a psychopath person. So that's kind of my take. You have to come down to what kind of person would do these actions. And the kind of person who would kill an actual like baby outside the womb is a deeply immoral person. The kind of person who would take the morning after pill and cause a lump of cells to, stop being alive is not somebody who deserves any kind of meaningful condemnation. Now, another question is, can there actually be greater morality from abortion? Because right now, all I'm saying is still basically just limited to, well, like a baby it's not really a person in the womb, like a fetus isn't really a person. So you can probably get away with it. Like that's as far as I've got so far. And I'm saying, like, well, it's not like genocide, is it? Which again is pretty tame. But the question is there an argument for it actually being better? So the question here is basically, can it at times be a case that certain moral positives will balance out the negatives of, a human life being extinguished? So the first point to consider is that the child themselves might have an issue. And you could make an argument that if there is nothing wrong with killing the fetus in the womb, that actually the moral consequence of having a human being be alive with some kind of debilitating issue is actually, or perhaps an issue that would kill them in not much time at all anyway, is actually worse than not having that child ever, grow up to be a person at all. So, for example, you can talk about all these things, whether it's blindness or, some kind of mental issue. But, I know people get bothered by that because people like to be irritating about stuff. So instead, I just want to talk about, like the idea of somebody, you have a child and you hear this child will have some kind of defect, which means that they will be likely to be dead before they reach the age of 10. At that point, you would ask yourself, well, is it better to have a child who will grow up to be a person, but only get to actually live as a person for 10 years and then die? Or is it better to just not have that child at all? And in which case, you would argue no person dies. So that's an example. And again, you could talk, you don't have to talk about life ending prematurely. You could just talk about the life not being as fulfilling. Like, are we actually going to say that maybe, if it's a choice between having a quadriplegic person, a quadriplegic, deaf, blind person, and no person at all, a lot of people, it shouldn't even be a controversial thing. There are plenty of people who I think would argue, it's kind of the whole argument around assisted suicide, that actually not being alive at all would be better than being quadriplegic and deaf and blind, not able to do anything. And, obviously, again, the question then becomes, well, what kind of, disabilities are so debilitating that it's actually such a terrible quality of life that it would be worse than even not existing? That is obviously a big question. But it's a question where, again, genuinely, if I went to the doctor and said, we can predict that your kid will be blind from birth and there's no chance we'll ever be able to fix it. Your kid will never see a sunrise, never see any of the beautiful things in the world. There will be part of me that would be like, that idea of, because I love being able to see, the idea of having a child and knowing that I could never show that child the world, show them the beauty of the world, anything like that would make me far less sad than just being like, well, I'm just not going to have this particular child. That's an example. Now, it's also worth noting that a lot of the time, the sum total isn't one less life. Because, while we could talk about like one life, a bad life versus no life, it's worth noting that most people expect to have a total number of children. and they don't want to exceed that number, whether it's 2 or 3 kids. It was kind of a standard number. So if you're only planning on having 2 or 3 kids, then aborting a kid is going to have some kind of serious illness is not meaning that there's going to be one less life in the world. It's meaning that that life can instead actually, you can then have another child who won't have this issue. And you can have, so rather than having 2 kids who are, perfectly healthy and happy and all of that, and then a 3rd kid who has some kind of really serious debilitating issue, you can have 3 kids that are all happy and healthy and all of that. So you have the same number of total people in the world. The only question is, what quality of life are those people going to have? Which seems like a distinction which, like in that case, the answer of which is more moral would seem to make obvious sense. If we can agree that it's kind of a bit silly to say that a fetus in the womb is a person, then yeah, I guess maybe not, terminating that pregnancy when at the point where you aren't killing a person, so that you can not bring into existence a person who's going to have a very, far worse quality of life, and then instead have 2 or 3, however many you're planning on having, children that will have a better quality of life. And the other thing is that it would actually make it worse for your other kids' lives, I think. Like it puts a massive strain on parents when they have to deal with a kid who is really seriously disabled. Almost all of the time, it puts a massive strain on them, which makes it harder for them to take care of their other kids. So actually, it's not just, if you had 2 perfectly happy, healthy kids and then 1 kid who was really seriously, had some kind of debilitating disability, then actually the other 2 kids get negatively affected as well. Whereas if you have 3 kids that are all healthy and happy and can take care of themselves, no issue, then that's far better for, actually those kids do better as well. And it's also worth noting that in the example where you have a debilitated kid, you may have, if I have 2 perfectly healthy kids, I may feel that I can manage having another kid. So you actually have more people who are happy and healthy and all of that alive. Whereas if I have 1 seriously disabled kid and then I have a healthy kid, at this point I might be thinking, can I really expend the energy? Can I, considering how much I'll have to spend focusing on this seriously disabled kid, can I afford to have a 3rd kid? Like, is that something I can actually do? And this kind of issue of directing resources can apply elsewhere. For example, if you have a kid at 16 or get pregnant at 16, then not only will that kid probably suffer, but any subsequent kids you have will also suffer, because having that kid at 16 is going to really interfere with you going to college, going to university, getting a good job, all of this stuff. It's going to mean that whereas conversely, if you have an abortion, then you do all of the stuff, make sure you're living your best life, and then maybe when you're in your late 20s, you have a kid, that kid's going to have a far better quality of life. So you're actually meaning that you're giving the actual people who will be alive better quality of life. And actually, this might be even the more kind of pro-family position, because rather than having a person who's raised out of wedlock, perhaps even without their dad around, you wait until you get married, you find the right guy, blah, blah, blah. You end up actually in a better situation. So if we're accepting this idea, and I think, it would make sense, that it doesn't really make sense to say that a baby in the womb, a fetus, if you like, is a person, then the argument becomes quite strong for, well, in that case, why is it not moral to, have abortions to ensure that the people who are people, the actual persons in our society, live the best quality of life they can? That would seem to make some sense. Now, it is worth noting that you could say that if the decision is purely, because here I'm talking about people who want to have kids eventually, you could say that if we're talking about somebody who gets an abortion because they don't want kids at all, and they just want to live their entire life perfectly, like basically just spending money on themselves, living for themselves, only caring about themselves, you could argue, well, in that case, maybe they are being kind of, selfish. And like actually from a moral perspective, again, legally they should be allowed to do that. But you could say, well, from a moral perspective, at that point they're extinguishing terminating a pregnancy just so they can live a life of like happy luxury, you could argue that that's putting themselves first. The thing is, I mean, conversely, with somebody who actually wants to have a family, and the majority of people do want to have families, if they're having an abortion, they're probably not just thinking about themselves. They're thinking about their future kids, the family they eventually want to have. So, yeah, I think obviously, as I already started off with this video, kind of saying, you could make an argument that, just solely focusing on yourself at the expense of somebody else being able to be alive could be objected to. But yeah, I'm not sure how serious of an issue it really is. And again, this is an example of why there is a debate. Now, I did just briefly want to touch on the religion aspect. Believe it or not, I didn't think this video was going to be as long as it would end up being. But I just want to say that, first of all, I don't think there's any hard scriptural proof for the idea that life begins at conception. There are like references to, knowing somebody in the womb. But again, that's like poetic language. And considering God knows everything, God knowing somebody in the womb, I don't see why that translates to them being a person. Obviously, I'm not going to go through every single individual piece of scripture that could possibly show life begins, at conception or whatever else, because it's all kind of, tenuous anyway, and I don't have time for it. I will say, of course, that, within a theistic worldview, life has more value, and that does mean that the idea of, like, you slowly kind of, like, that question of, because obviously in a Christian worldview, you have, like, people having a soul, and the question goes, well, when do people actually get souls? And like, that's an interesting question. Does somebody get a soul as soon as conception, or do they get a soul as soon as they're born? Like, basically, it means that there is this actual like objective significance to life, and we kind of a bit, it kind of creates the question. Well, when does that objective significance and when does that personhood actually begin? It's worth noting, if it does begin at conception, like if your soul is established at conception, then it does lead to some incredibly counterintuitive, conclusions. The most obvious one being that the vast majority of people in heaven are children who never lived life at all. Because generally speaking, most people will agree that, children who have barely, haven't actually been able to sin, who haven't reached the age of accountability, they go to heaven automatically. That's a generally held view, and I, would be inclined to agree with it. But the implication of that would be that, therefore, if you have a soul as soon as you're born, as soon as conception, the vast majority of people throughout history have actually, the majority of pregnancies end in miscarriages, I believe. And that was more so true in the past, before even getting to the huge number of children who would die in infancy. Massive numbers of children would die in infancy. So, based on that logic, you would have to conclude that heaven is 99.9999, overwhelmingly a huge amount, filled with babies. Presumably they would be people. They would develop into people, but they would be people who never actually lived on Earth. The majority of people in heaven, if you have a soul at the moment of conception, the majority of people in heaven never spent a day outside the womb, which is kind of it's a bit trippy to think about, and it doesn't disprove the idea, but I think a lot of people would say that's kind of counterintuitive, and that's possibly one reason to think maybe there's got to be another explanation. But it's definitely true that with religion, there is an objectively correct answer. Because, if I say abortion is fine, and then God says it isn't, then as far as I'm concerned, the correct answer is obvious. God's right. But the issue is that we don't know. The problem is, obviously in a kind of atheistic worldview, there is no objective answer to what's right or wrong. It's not like, there's no kind of final grade at the end. You make the moral decisions you make, and that's it. So if somebody says, I think abortion is fine, well, that's their opinion, and that's it. But as soon as you add in a theistic idea of there actually being a God, well, then you do get a final grade. And God will say, you know what, you said abortion was right, it's actually wrong. So that does add a pressure to it. But the problem is that while there is a correct answer in a theistic worldview, that doesn't make it any easier to tell what the correct answer is. So all I can kind of do is go off my intuition and say, well, I just don't see how, as soon as I procreate with somebody, at that point, just a person has been created immediately. That just doesn't really make any sense to me. And I guess the ultimate conclusion here is, I don't know. That's the end of the video. With all of this said, things are complicated. And I mean, sure, I guess you could say, well, if somebody just wants to have an abortion just so they can, like spend all the money on themselves and just only focus on themselves and not care, not have to, have the responsibility of taking care of another human being, maybe that's kind of selfish for them to not care about the reality of being able to keep a child alive, but choosing not to do it. But then at that point, maybe you could say that's just as much a question about like not having children at all. Like, should everybody choose to have children because that's less selfish? Or, like basically when you're talking about something which is mostly determined by, if people are using conception and stuff like that, bad luck if the conception fails, well, you're just punishing people for bad luck at that point. But the thing is, to conclude with what I've already said, I just find it interesting there is this massive disconnect between the legality of abortion, which I think is very obvious, and I just don't think there's any good argument for the claim that women should be forced. Like, the forced pregnancy argument is nonsense. There is no argument for it, it's complete nonsense. But it's interesting that there is a massive disconnect between that and the far more difficult question of whether or not abortion is actually moral. So I just find that kind of disagreement interesting. My camera is flashing, so it could go off at any point. It's been flashing for a while, and I'm kind of expecting it to cut me off like in the middle of the sentence. And if that happens, you'll know what's happened. But because if it happened at this point, I'm not going to plug it in, record like the last final seconds. But yeah, that's the end of the video. So yeah, I almost want to see if I can just wait for it to. It should shut down. Like, I'm surprised it's lasted so long because it went like flashing red like 5 minutes ago, whatever. Anyway, okay, I'm not going to wait until it shuts down because it's taken a while. So yeah, that's my opinion. I suppose it wasn't that